and welcome to another winter episode with a beard, obviously, of REDtalks.live. I'm your host, Nathan Pierce. I'm actually wearing grown-up clothes today instead of one of my normal nerd dev shirts because I'm here in head office at F5. But more importantly, I have a guest with me who's just written a book. We'll talk about that a bit later. Jason Edelman from Networks to Code. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Nathan. Glad to be here. My name is Jason, as you said. So my background is, I like to point out for these kinds of episodes, a traditional network engineer who spent his time doing routing, switching, load balancing type of technology. And several years ago, made that shift into programmability and automation, API work, and started a company called Network to Code in 2014. And now I spend most of my days interacting with customers and clients and helping them do training and consulting services, really just a matter to understand sort of the impact and the shift the industry is happening and really help them adopt, we'll say, ways to do better network operations. So I'll keep it high level for now, we can kind of dive in, but it's all a matter of how do we operate the network holistically more efficiently.
So anyone who's been watching this channel for a little while is not surprised at all why we have Jason on here, because that's all we talk about. We get to the book in a minute, but I guess what I'm really interested in, what's your perspective of where the world's at? Like, are we, 10% of the people really innovating like crazy and the other 90% are still, we know we need to do it, but we're not sure. Like, where do you think that balance is? What's your feel of what's going on in the market?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think, I was one of the believers in next-gen networking several years ago. I thought the world was going to change overnight. Network to Code again started, 3.5 years ago, and I thought this was going to happen overnight. Fast forward to right now, I think, given a lot of our client engagements, if this was a baseball game, maybe we're in the second inning. Maybe it's somewhere in call it the first three innings where there's been a lot of great change from vendors, let's say from product manufacturers. And just being aware of what an API means on a network device. I remember 3 years ago it was just totally new. What that even meant. It was having things like Python on a network device, and mentioning tools like an Ansible or Puppet we didn't even know what that meant 3-4 years ago in the network space. So I think there's been a huge shift in education. And again, kudos to F5, what you guys have done there as well. But I think there's been a big shift in education. And I think the next, so still early on, but the next couple of years will be interesting to see, how this continues to get adopted once these skills are continued to be taught to all the current network engineers that, likely are still doing things, we'll say, the manual way and, CLI and GUIs and things of that nature. But still very early on and still, a lot of goodness to come for sure.
I like that you focused on education there, Jason, because I think that's what's been lacking. I think a lot of organizations, like especially networking vendors, realized, okay, we're not going to get away with not providing an API now. We can't hide from this kind of movement of automating things. However, what a lot of them did was they just published an API and they didn't openly say it, but it was kind of like, yeah, and you go work that out. And the thing is, APIs they're not the native language of your traditional network operations department. So how are we meant to make this jump from, okay, I've been using a CLI and I know that well. I mean, because let's face it, networking's not really evolved in the way we interface with Kit in a long time. So I'm great at that. And now you're asking me to understand like developer principles and practices that I've never, what's this item potency and all these crazy words you're throwing at me now? And I'm meant to just know that. And hence I think that's why it's not happened overnight. The willingness to automate has come pretty quickly, but the ability to execute has been the problem. Would you say that's a fair statement?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's challenges in itself for education, getting the time away from the day-to-day to understand what these APIs mean, how they're used. Then there's time spent on the debate. Do I learn to program? Do I learn, saying API is the new CLI? That causes other debates out there. But the truth is we need dedicated time to educate the market. And if it means SSH to log into a device via CLI, so now we're going to look at maybe curl and postman and learn how to use these APIs without even programming. So there's a big gap there. Being aware we can learn APIs without programming, And beyond that, for sure, I think, again, from our perspective, my network to code, I'll say, working with clients to help build these roadmaps and strategies, because, we're seeing, a lot of folks get started right now, and often what we'll see is a lot of engineers are going to make the shift for automation, and maybe it's through custom scripts, maybe it's through open source tools and things like that. So if they're going to be deploying a change on Friday or Saturday at a given window, maybe deploying some more virtual servers, adding some more servers into a pool, whatever the change might be, it's saying, hey, you know what, let's look at automating that potentially. And it could be, hypothetically, in certain customers of ours, might not even be aware of management. So we're just going to leverage these skills and automate in an ad hoc fashion. And so we're seeing a lot of folks experiment with Git, storing their config files and GitHub, things like that. But really the challenge is, well, how do we actually do this at a larger scale and make this more, we'll say, IT centric or team centric, group centric, and expand from individual to team to department. And I think that's where we're going to see like the biggest change in the next couple of years, where people are starting to dabble and experiment and really understand what it is. But the real challenges, in my opinion, are still gonna come, because it's very easy to get started, as an individual, through learning, but understanding how we're going to operate, data centers and campuses holistically, with some form of automation. We're gonna have to do a lot more education on, we'll say, design-centric patterns, where we're still in the phase of almost like technology education, what the API is, what this kind of interface is, what templating means. Then we'll have to shift. Well, we understand those foundational elements. Now, how do we apply those foundational elements and technologies, to manage a network or networks holistically, for sure.
That's really cool. I totally understand and appreciate that sentiment. A colleague, you reminded me of something a colleague said to me a while back. This is a question he asked his customer. He's in the field. He always says, so, okay, moving forward, you've seen the way everything around you is being automated, app lifecycle, like CI/CD tool chains, continuous deployment. So ask yourself now, do I want to be the button pusher or the button creator? Because over time, the button pusher's going to be abstracted higher and higher and higher, and you won't be needed to push the button anymore, because everyone around you is orchestrated, and you manage the button you created in the new world order. But the people doing the deployment press the button now, not you. This idea of take a ticket, do the implementation, close the ticket, that's just going down and down. That's vanishing. And I love that analogy. Where do you see yourself in 5 years from now?
There's discussions, analogies people might make to IP voice, right? Things of that nature. And for automation, I usually, when I give presentations, I usually have a closing thought slide. And one of the slogans I like using is, be the automator, not the automated. So you want to, the whole, there's, talk about risk of jobs. You know what? It's the nature of the world that we live in. Automation, and I'll say, will at some point affect jobs, like for sure. I don't think we're there at all, because we want to be able to scale our teams. I should say scale the network deployments without having to linearly scale our teams. I think that's really important right now. But at some point, we're going to look at resource utilization and things of that nature. And but right now, if you are the person that's exploring how you can do automation, you're going to do just fine in your career, right? You really want to be like that one who's at least trying to do automation. Otherwise, you go from being automator to automated, and I don't think any one of us, if we're trying to automate ourselves out of a job, I think we're going to be doing some good things.
Well, you know what I've noticed? The people that jumped on this earlier and automated themselves out of a ticket-taking network operations job, they're now site reliability engineers that are looking across broader platforms, and actually they are far more critical to an organization's success. So you're not eliminating your ability to be employed by automating your current job out of the way. You're actually opening up infinitely more opportunities. So I think maybe I've seen a bit of that in the media, the whole automation, everyone's going to lose this. That's just so crazy. Like, it's not
I agree. I agree. Unfortunately, there are still some, management teams that, could even, think that. And I think, as long as, teams have the resources and time to understand what it can do, they're going to be well off. Where it's unfortunate, where, some, clients we deal with, and even friends of the industry, like they have to go on their personal time, nights and weekends, to build an internal POC to prove to management. Then management sees it and they want more of it now. So it's just really trying to get that right mixture of, making sure people are aware of what's possible. And, sometimes it's hard to map automation to a business outcome, when you're just getting started, in an organization. But that's where, hopefully, we all help with that, as vendors.
Yeah.
Look at predictability and speed and all these good things from, compliance and, onboarding new applications, and it could be a custom application provisioning. There's so many, good things we can do with automation. And, it's really trying to, make sure folks are aware of like the impact it can do to their business. And, as an engineer, like that'll help them start to experiment and deploy these newer technologies.
Totally. So moving on to the topic at hand today, anyone who's watched this channel has heard me go on about Super NetOps. Again, as the person who coined the term at F5. In fact, I now have my personalized Super NetOps.
Nice.
I mean, I'm going
to those too. Yeah.
I can't really show you the lid of my laptop because it's behind this camera, but it's covered in Super NetOps. So at F5, we're very passionate about creating this kind of automation, supporting application lifecycle. And most people know us as this hardware load balancing company, which is like this much. We're about the layer 7 services: security, bot detection, cross-site request forgery, mitigation, not creating cross-site request forgery, but protecting against it, and all these layer 7 services. And how can we make that automated as part of the delivery? What's been missing, though, and something that we run into all the time, is we've been working hard. We created the Super NetOps training program. We're teaching people how to automate the delivery of layer 7 policies for security, high resilience, and availability. But then if they do all of that, but they still manually provision the network underneath, well, there was no point. If you're not automating all of it, you're never really realizing accelerated business. Why just automate a single bit? So we do all the layer 7 services, and then there was this part missing. So suddenly this book appeared on my radar, and I thought, yes, eureka. That might be the first time I've ever said eureka, even though I'm from Australia. Someone started to solve the layer 2 to 4 part of this, like getting the network, the plumbing, the conduit, the data planes that we can put these layer 7 services on. That needs to be automated as well. So I bought the book immediately and flipped through that as quick as I can, and now I'm going through it again at normal speed because I was a bit too excited the first time. You're the lead author on this book, Jason. Tell us what you've done.
Right. So, first off, big thanks to all three of us as co-authors, myself, Matt Oswald, and Scott Lowe, for sure. I think, we all spent, quite a bit of time, writing that book, and I should say writing it, doing edits, peer reviews for one another. And, but I think the initial thought, I think I had reached out to Matt and Scott a while back. And, for one, I do apologize how long it took to get the book published. But, there's our day jobs and the amount of time it takes to do a peer review. And so huge apologies for the folks who pre-ordered a long time ago. But yeah, initially again, it goes back to the roots of, looking back at, sort of my career and doing a traditional, we'll say, summarize it, layer 2, layer 4, I think layer 2, layer 3, I think that's great, where a lot of time spent architecting and designing networks. And it's like, hey, like there's a real problem with what happens when this network's installed. And that's the part of networking that hasn't changed. And when I say networking, I'll refer to layer 2 to layer 7, and saying that hasn't changed in like 20 years. And there's been a lot of change in terms of incremental change, adding new features here and there, and that overlay protocol versus that overlay protocol. And so when we started, when 2013, 14, when this started to shift, it was like, hey, again, it comes back to education, where we're sort of doing our thing here on training in the classroom, but it's like, hey, there was no material on the internet, there was no books on this topic. And since we were in the process of writing, other books also emerged, from vendors and independent third parties. And so like the initial thought was saying, hey, we have to kind of bottle up, some of these core skills that we believe the next gen network engineer needs. And some folks even on Twitter in the past couple of days saying, hey, this isn't next gen anymore. This is like current network engineer. Like these skills network engineers need today, not necessarily tomorrow. But so we started introducing sort of like these core skills, foundational elements like Linux and Python and templates, and going above and beyond some tooling and CI/CD. You really tried to break it down. Again, you're not going to become an expert reading the book, but it provides some of that foundation of some of these skills. We think we'll say network engineer, but really every engineer that's operating a system or with an IT that should have some know-how of in the future.
The two things really stood out at me, and I'd love to get like your perspective of them. The first one was like right at the beginning, it's explained that you don't read this like a novel and put it on your shelf. I mean, there's a lot of things. I read through the whole thing like it was a novel, but obviously it's like all I do is like automate stuff. So I was like, oh, awesome, you did that. That's really cool. Love that you talked about templating, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're coming along new to this, I agree. Like, don't try and just read through it to understand what's in there, but keep that handy, keep that on your desk and refer back to it. And when you find yourself automating something in a very kind of sequential, like imperative way, think, he talked about templates. I think I now need to learn more about the templates and go back to that, because sometimes it's only when you've been exposed to the problem that you realize, now I get why he talked about templating. It's not because we're still back in the 90s trying to do a mail merge in Office 97. Actually, templating means I don't have to do all the stuff repetitively that is the same all the time. So I loved it first that you just introduced it as give it a read through to know where each bit is, but keep it handy. It's a reference kind of material that you can keep.
Yeah, exactly. Again, there was 3 of us as authors. And Scott Lowe, as an example, wrote the chapter on Git, learning how to use Git, what it is with GitHub, and like that is an insanely great chapter. And for myself personally, I'm going referencing that all the time, because day to day you might use 4 or 5 Git commands to get started, but when you want to do some more complex things, it's really like again like that could be a mini intro to Git book in itself. And the same could be said for other chapters as well. But you definitely, if it's used as a reference guide, per topic, I think that's the right way to look at it.
So before we go on to the second thing that I really appreciated, and I'd love to get your take on, what you just said there reminded me when I was reading it, because I read various blogs from people and spoken to people like you guys, and heard you give talks at things. I was trying to work out who wrote what bits based on like the voice, and you can if you're really paying attention. Like I've read loads of Scott Lowe's blogs. I mean, anyone who's done a VMware certification knows who Scott Lowe is, because he writes about all the practice exams. And I was trying to guess, and there's a couple times I was like, I think I know who wrote that paragraph. Just because
I would love to, folks that have read all 3 of us, our blogs, I would love a survey to see if somebody could guess every chapter. And there's a lot of it was chapter by chapter. There were a few sections where we collaborated on for sure. And I would love to see maybe a little survey. Maybe we'll do that in the future. Once we get more copies out there.
You can totally do that as like those Twitter surveys. Chapter 1, who wrote this page?
Exactly.
A, B, or C. I think that would actually be kind of cool. That was a fun part for me skimming through this. I'm like, that was Scott. He wrote that bit. That was kind of fun. So the second thing that jumped out at me was, and I really appreciated this, because I think a lot of networking vendors have been guilty of just going, here's my API, work it out. And obviously it's not a native language to people who are trying to make that evolution in their career towards automation to become the button creator instead of just the button pusher. So I loved when I got to those sections where you explained about the values of templating and not copying and pasting all the commands, and actually just automating the generation of the set of commands required, but giving only the variables that change each time. And I can't talk about the importance of that concept enough. You're limiting exposure to errors because it's automated in that, and actually you're reducing the touch point of your automation tool chain. It's just filling in little bits and not building monolithic configs every time. So
Yeah.
tell me about that and how much do you push that in your world, and like how important do you see that?
Yeah, in general, a huge amount. And I would say templating specifically, the great thing about templating is you can get started with templating without actually touching networking devices. We can practice using these concepts, because if you're going to use templating to decouple, we'll say, our data inputs, our data variables, and our actual, it could be CLI commands. But a lot of times it's a misconceived notion that a template is going to be for CLI commands. So we like to showcase a template could be for JSON or XML. You might have a template for a report. A lot of times we'll actually gather data, parse it, and then put it through a CSV template, and to create various use cases for templates to showcase what they can be used for. But in all of these use cases, if we're templating CLI commands, if it's JSON or XML based on the API being used, or if it's reports, all that could be used in an offline manner. And that also means we'll have to store our data somewhere. So we end up while we're getting an introduction to potentially a templating language, we might also be introducing something like YAML files, often also very new for network engineers who are diving into this. And so if we understand the decoupling of data and templates, we can practice, we'll say, rendering that together to create a config snippet, config file, or a report. And so oftentimes, folks who lack test equipment, and which these days shouldn't be an issue because virtual appliances exist, so there shouldn't be a lack of devices to test on. But even if you're on a plane, right? If you're flying on a plane 30,000 feet in the air, you can still actually start to dabble in this notion of create a template, create your data file, create a config file from those two files, and in your next change, we see a lot of folks start with a manual copy and paste of that, get more comfortable with what's being generated from the template, and then great, we trust it. Now let's start testing the automatic deployments of that. The flip side is true as well, where if we've tested like this report template, maybe it's CSV, maybe it's a text file. We've seen a lot of markdown templates pushing back to GitHub. And this sort of thing is great because we might start with issuing an API call or a SSH to the device, have data stored in a text file, practice parsing that and generating a report. Again, a lot of this can be tested offline if we just throw a show command into a file or a sample API response into a file. We can start practicing in an offline manner. So use of templates, definitely see it a ton day to day, and it really is a good place to start for those folks, we'll say, getting started on their journey with network automation.
That was a great bit of advice you put there. I mean, often, especially people who have been doing it for a long time, I talk about the full continuous deployment end solution, and you definitely don't start at that. And I like your advice there of using offline. So I can create the automated templating process that just generates an output, and I manually implement that output. And that allows me to get really comfortable with that templating automation system before it ever touches a device. Even in my lab, I can do that manually because at least then I'm getting to review the output before I implement it and say, that's actually exactly what I typed out. And once I'm comfortable with doing that for maybe a week or a month or however long I need to feel comfortable, then I can do that last step and say, you know what, I'm no longer copying and pasting it. I'm going to let the template just do the implementation as well. And it's stepping stones. But if you start with the right abstraction early, so you do the templating now, you're going to avoid this problem where you start spewing the schema up into the tool chain, which gets you into vendor lock-in, it gets you into support nightmares. So anyone starting on this, do the template learning. That would be my big bit of advice up front, even if you're manually implementing at the end of it, just to get familiar with those concepts, because we can't have like port-specific settings being up there in the app deployment tool. We can't keep exposing and pushing the schema and the nuances of individual devices up. I mean, you get locked in, you can't move, it's not agile. You have to have those abstraction levels, and templating is the best way to create abstraction. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, it's a great start. Creating a vendor neutral, could be data structure that's consumed in specific template types. I think that's a great way to get started. But even just to touch upon the one thing, like you mentioned, the deployment process, CI/CD a couple times. And even in this process, if you want to, as a human, view the render configuration, to apply it manually, and then a next step logically is to automatically deploy that configuration. But even as an interim step, when we start looking at what a workflow could be, we might still want a human to approve it. So when we start looking at this as a robust workflow for the enterprise, it might be where our tooling system communicates back to a GitHub API to post what that looks like, what new snippet is being generated, and then a human views it on GitHub and clicks merge, and then next thing you know, some great stuff happens in the background. So there's, like you said, I think there's a lot of stepping stones and a lot of building blocks. And again, for what it's worth, we see a lot of folks still thinking about getting started. And so at the very least, folks just have to kind of dip their foot in and start somewhere. And next thing you know, you're kind of starting to integrate with more tools, more platforms. We see this a lot with even let's say F5 devices where what IP address do you want to use for virtual IP? Well, right now we're still okay. If you want to manually go to some other tool or unfortunately Excel spreadsheet to get the next available IP address, for now we'll say it's okay to get started. But we want to think about how do we leverage IPAM systems, IP address management systems, that's really coordinating and understanding what IPs are in use. And then we don't have to have that in the ticket you mentioned, right? We can say, go fetch me the next IP address, because we don't want to have to worry about, what application is using which IP address. Just fetch the next one and automatically update the DNS entry after you deploy. So, however, all that sounds, it could be robust and complex, and there's a lot of moving parts there, which is accurate, but it shouldn't prevent somebody to get started with manually filling out a form with the IP address. And well, how do we automatically get that IP address? Well, if the IP scheme is structured and standard, it's much easier. If it's not, then it'll be harder to automate.
So my favorite recommendation, you mentioned curl, Postman as well.
Yeah.
Often when people ask me to do something, I'll say, look, I can give you the steps. I can give you a Postman collection that you just import and then run that collection. And you are effectively automating already, because what you're doing when you run that collection, you can now export that and turn that into whatever flavor you prefer, Ansible Playbook, Chef Cook, you name it. You can just transfer that exact same concept because you just created templating and you just created an automated process right there. So baby steps. Make yourself the source of truth to begin with. You input the data, but you're at least automating it, not putting everything in there, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
We're kind of at time. I don't want to run over. I know you've got another commit to run to, and so do I. But I feel like we should probably do a series and just go into some of these topics in more detail. I feel like we have a lot of things.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
That'd be cool. Okay, so you've been listening to another REDtalks.live episode. I'm Nathan Pierce from F5 Networks, and I talked a bit about SuperNetOps again. I know I go on about it a lot, but today it was all about the book that Jason and his peers have created to help people start this journey. So thanks for coming along, Jason. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Where can people get the books quickly before we go?
So you can get it on Amazon or O'Reilly. The book is called Network Automation and Programmability by O'Reilly.
Excellent. Network Automation and Programmability by O'Reilly. Give it a read. We're all singing on the same hymn sheet. That's awesome. Let's get all these services automated. So thanks again. You've been listening to Jason and Nathan. Have a great day. Thanks for listening.